that is, these are the hardest questions to answer, the personal ones, um, because there are just so many textures and so many ways in which you belong to a place that it's hard to kind of disentangle what, when, and where. But so I'm originally Kashmiri. Um, I did not grow up there, and so it was. And that in itself, I mean, I did not grow up there physically, but I grew up there psychologically and mentally, if that makes sense. In the same way in which, for instance, I was here the last 2 days, and for the year and more before that, but I wasn't in London. I was, I mean, definitely like, and last, Saturday, Sunday, I was in Delhi. In my head, in terms of how I felt and what I was going through, it felt like I was with the people there because I was reading them, I was talking to them, I was so I think this is something really important for me, the ways in which, and this is conceptually also relevant to some of the things that we'll talk about, is this idea of location. I was just reflecting on that last night. I mean, I don't know if you get a chance, please look at my Twitter feed. There's this Twitter thing that I did just last night on I think that it's so important to have a kind of of a radical, rather, as opposed to a facile sort of cosmopolitanism, whereby we can think about location in a decolonial way, so that you're not thinking, so a location isn't just where you are, because obviously Ambani and the homeless person in Bombay are both in Bombay, but they're not both in the same Bombay. So so where we are is not just, it's not determined. I mean, it's a simple enough point, but I think it's a lot of the times we just take it for granted, including when ideas of where the West is, where the non-West is, who the colonizer is, who the colonized are. In all of these things, it's just assumed that location is somehow just physical, which it isn't. So in that sense, I mean, I grew up with a very immediate sense of being Kashmiri, but not being in Kashmir. And so, in and that disconnect manifested itself in multiple ways. In For instance, through the nostalgia of my parents, specifically my father, who would always talk to us about Kashmir, through lots of objects at home that were all about Kashmir, through a sense of knowing that we were Kashmiri, but not quite understanding as a child why we weren't in Kashmir. And and I had been, of course, I had been with my grandparents and my parents at a very early age, but not since late 80s. And then to have relatives who we hadn't seen in years, and they suddenly come to Delhi, and we know that we have these extended relatives who are Kashmiris, but why haven't we seen them before? Why have they come to Delhi now? So there's all of this political thing that is happening, and then there's the silence around that in terms of your own experience, of my own experience, because one just, these are days before the internet, before those sorts of things, before even easy phone calls. So the ways in which things was different. So yes, so there was that kind of personal texture of that relationship, memories, early memories, of course, of Srinagar, but then a space of time before going back there again. But never quite feeling at home in Delhi. So this is something that I think both in my academic work and scholarly kind of more public work, but also in my fiction, in both in residue and in future tense, I've tried to kind of speak about that. Just not there not being enough points of connect, because it's not, we weren't, I mean, I was in Delhi, but I wasn't, I that's not where I was from. It's a sort of question that every kind of post-colonial person has faced, like, where are you from, and how do you begin to answer that question of where you're from? So it was a bit like that, of not quite knowing where you're from, why you're where you are. Our festivals were different. Language was different. Nobody really knew very much about us other than some sort of an exotic idea. And then, of course, from the 90s onwards, it started to feature as a place in films and and in TV. So there was that kind of stereotypical representation, which went from, of course, exoticization to demonization, and almost always feminization. And this is something, so for instance, in the 2010 piece, which was for me a really important threshold point of writing about it, this Kashmir the beautiful or Kashmir the cruel being the stereotypes, the Orientalist sort of stereotypes through which Kashmir was approached. So yes, I was Kashmiri. I I it's a thing with how, so when I say Kashmiri, I try to constantly emphasize that I'm talking about Kashmiri as an identity, not necessarily, and in fact not in communal terms. I do not profess any religion. I'm an animist and a humanist, but I was born a Kashmiri Pandit, and that's obvious to people from my name within the South Asian context. So, given that my political and intellectual views do not align with how I'm supposed to be thinking, my identity becomes always already sort of a kind of traitorous sort of an identity. And there has been a cost that has been there, that has been exacerbated over time, but that has become, kind of, that just continues to increase and accelerate that cost of alienation from family and community networks, because there's no way. I haven't seen or spoken to those people, who are my kin, in God knows how long, because what would we speak about? There's just no political connect. They're just almost like from a different planet. It would just not be possible. On top of which, for me, what has always been important is the fundamentally gendered existent nature of existence. So as a feminist, I think this is something that has been really important to me. My father died when we were young, so growing up we weren't privileged. So it's all intersectional. So it's, you don't, you're privileged in some ways but not in others. So yes, of course, I mean, I was privileged in the sense I had a house in it and I could go to school, but my father died young. My mother was, a teacher. We were struggling, and in that context, to be a single parent female in a city like Delhi, and to kind of, with my sister and me, so we didn't have like a brother or other male relatives, just put us in a very particular sort of a place. So there are these different kinds of axes of of vulnerability that one faced. I mean, I was just actually talking to some of the young students in college today, and I was just thinking, telling them about, standing for these positions, and then just getting these death and rape threats. So this kind of intimidation that you face being a woman is something that I think has always been there, and over time, speaking and writing about Kashmir, that has become even more obvious to me. So Residue, I think, was the first, was for me that first step of writing in fiction about being, about these characters who were Kashmiri, and talking about divided places. The 2010 piece on Kashmir, A Place of Blood and Memory, was the first one that actually exposed me to what happens when you talk about Kashmir, what sorts of voices can get heard, and what would you face. I mean, the some of those horrible, graphic, sexualized kinds of hate messages and things. I mean, it's a, it's was I mean, since then it's just become something that one lives with, but you never quite get used to it, and with every passing year that just becomes really hard. So yes, it's really hard to speak up as a woman, and I think as a Kashmiri, and as and to be saying these sorts of things, including in the post-colonial context. So for me, I don't know what's my relationship to Kashmir. It's that it's a place of belonging. It's a place of conflict. It's a place of where I've inherited pain and suffering. I mean, to have. I think when my father died, the thing that he would have wanted most, this is during the peak of the worst years, would have been to be able to see Kashmir once again, to be able to get that kind of breath. So it's a various kinds of traumas that have over time just layered and layered, and to see the injustices that get perpetrated in the name of an identity like mine is the fact that this is being done somehow to kind of help either develop or help or whatever. It's the whole thing is just so toxic, and so it's important to keep drawing attention to that as well. I've now completely forgotten what your original question was, other than, yes, it's a very conflicted relationship. It's something that I've tried to come to terms with in both analytically and affectively, and it's just there isn't a Kashmir. There are just so many Kashmirs that different people access in their histories and in the memories that they are able to um, recall, experience, remember. and what I have tried to constantly foreground in my work is that these are places which, which have historically been um, zones of contact between different kinds of people, and that have over time turned into zones of conflict. And in the Himalayas in particular, and you see that in terms of people's languages and dress and culture, what one calls culture, but is can be much more nuanced, but that how that changes, and the mosaic of all of that historically. And and that process of accommodation, negotiation, even conflict was much more fluid and much more adaptive to times before the modern nation statist era freeze frames that in ways that then get tied to this kind of India Pakistan rivalry, or even India Pakistan China rivalry, which does something very fundamentally violent to that region by first by that imperial cartography, and then by the kinds of post-colonial securitizations that these states then project onto that entire kind of region, from one end to the other. And then there are the kind of historical hierarchies within those societies, the feudal hierarchies, the aristocratic hierarchies, the king, the rulers, and the different kinds of peasants and artisans and craftsmen and court, people who worked in the court, those kinds of hierarchies. Then there's religious and regional differences between people based on how they earned their livelihood, how close did that mean that they had to be to centers of power. So all of these things are, it's yes, it's in terms of, like, if I think about what in the European context, I think one place to think about would be like the Balkans. There's just this so much there in terms of, and so much violence that has happened to these different groups of people, um, that it then ends up seeming like it's become an imbroglio, but it's only that imbroglio because a certain kind of territorial possession is being privileged over people's rights, or things like popular sovereignty. uh, and over time, the vested interests that have come into play have become so strong. And then you have, and all of this is before even we get to the present, the last, what, 5-10 years, when with the kind of ideological aspect to it. So there's that kind of nationalist violence, and then there's other kinds of religious communal violence that state sanctioned religious communal violence that we come to in the more recent years. So it's there's no. I've often said that every narrative is landmined with vested interests, in every kind of political narrative that you hear about in the context of Kashmir, but also different people will start telling the history of Kashmir from different amounts of time in the back, in different amounts of time back in time. So whether you want to tell it from 89, 91, or 47, or 1846, whether you want to tell it from the point of the Exodus, or you want to tell it from the point of view of the plebiscite, or the Treaty of Amritsar, or you want to go further back to the indigenous rulers, Yusuf Shah Chak, or if you want to go even much more further back to the times of the kind of ancient times, and the or even the Buddhist past. So there's just layers, and different people will pick and choose different points from which the history will begin to be told, and how and what they will choose to spotlight, and at the cost of what, and or not even at the cost of what they'll choose to spotlight, and how that will create the narrative, that particular meaning in narrative of either always peaceful coexistence, only problematic now, or never any coexistence, always kind of ancient hatred, or different points at which people collaborated, and there were possibilities, where things might have gone otherwise, and there was hope. So that really depends, and that's the whole power knowledge thing. That's where scholarship, or accounts, written text comes in, written and other text comes in terms of how that's constructed. it depends really on which people, but there's of course censorship in and on Kashmir. Uh, Depending on where one is and at what period of time, it's become much worse in recent years. It was always there, but I think if we're speaking about India in the post 2014 context, it's become much worse. I know that, I know this not, I know this from personal experience, of course, but I would also say that I know this from, from a professional perspective, as somebody who has been reading, writing, and speaking about Kashmir for well over a decade, and as an adult in the public domain, and as somebody who kind of works in both scholarly and in a literary sense on Kashmir and supervises students' work on Kashmir. So just to be able to see what sorts of things they face, and I think that there isn't the what you can say on Kashmir is systematically being narrowed, and and where you can be heard. Now, I want to get something out of the way first, which is that there aren't, just isn't just about West and non-West, the decolonization thing, right? So there's something I wrote just a few months ago called India, India, Kashmir, China, Xinjiang, or India, China, Xinjiang, Kashmir. Basically, it's a kind of logical structure. It's like India is to Kashmir as China is to Xinjiang, to say how, how in both of these contexts we can see the ways in which these populations of these regions are treated, and how that is done through what I call the moral wound of colonialism. It's a little long to go into that context here, but there's also a talk I did at Villanova in February on which explains that. But I think the article should be the easiest way to see that argument, that the ways in which a certain kind of anti-colonial sentiment is used in countries like India and China in order to then exercise colonial sorts of power on their own peripheral, on these populations. But also how that's problematic, because by doing so, they use the rhetoric of "we are not Western," and then the question becomes, well, how are they not Western? They are not Western not because they are eschewing conspicuous consumption or commercialization or malls or whatever. So they're not Western in the sense that they don't. So they're not Western is a human rights is an argument used only in a human rights context. And my point is that I argue there is that this if West is all about human rights, and that's how you're using this logic, then how do you square that with the whole colonial history of the West? Because surely the anti-colonial struggles against the West are fundamentally demonstrative of how human rights are not the preserve of any one part of the world. It's not like you're genetically kind of prone to caring about human rights because you're from a certain latitude and longitude. So it's problematic, it's logically flawed, but it's an ideology that functions. So just as that West non-West simplistic binarism is problematic, I think even just and sometimes that comes into play in this India Pakistan context as well, when people say, well, it's like one side is all right and the other side is all wrong. And I've no love lost for either of these states when it comes to Kashmir, which is not to say that what they're doing in that specific region is the same for both of these states. But I find it very problematic to, to to deal with the argument that somehow Turkey can do no wrong, Pakistan can do no wrong to in to the Kurds, or China can do no wrong in Xinjiang, or in Pakistan and Balochistan, because these regions just won't. It's only something that is an Indian thing. I mean, yes, of course, what India is doing in Kashmir is absolutely abhorrent, and this is important to emphasize. But it cannot be done by saying that everywhere there isn't a problem in these other places, because I feel like the struggles of these stateless nations, Palestine, Kashmir, the Kurds, Tibetans, etc., now even Hong Kong, these sorts of regions, there's essentially conceptually something very similar that's problematic, which is this kind of possessive territorial aspect of that comes into play. And I'm very honest about this, including in public. I've called people out for this, that it's not about there being any simple solution to saying that India is wrong means Pakistan is right. That's not how it works. I mean, India Pakistan's it's so infantile just looking at this complex issue only through India Pakistan rivalry, but it also comes into play through the India versus Kashmir thing. When people go, well, it doesn't matter what happens in Indian politics, and this is unbelievable as it is. This is a view that many people hold, that actually even before Modi came to power, numerous Kashmiris, that online would say, well, it's good if a Hindutva government comes to power, they'll be able to kind of do better than the. So it's kind of, it's problematic when you're not, when people don't see the connect, how these things are all connected, the injustices are all connected. So that being said, I think how people get to know about Kashmir, the censorship has increased so much. I used to be, I used to write, and and do media interviews, and I still do that. But post 20, even and I've spoken on BBC, Al Jazeera, you name it, like every channel and forum. But I have never, ever, ever been asked for a single interview on any Indian TV channel. Now, I don't think that that's just a coincidence, or that's, I mean, how is it the case that okay, fine, 2015, the Mehdi Hasan thing, that was okay. I challenged Ram Madhav, but I mean, not a single person asked. Print, yes, I mean, the occasional print media, even though print is now decreasing, but the social, yeah, the wire scroll, but not on any kind of channel. I gave testimony at the US Congress in October 2019 on Kashmir, and and that was it was a really important thing to happen, that hearing, because of the pressure it put on the Indian government at that point. So at that, so once that happens, and there's, it just belied all logic. It was really hard to see that kind of you can deal with ignorance, but what do you do when you see people who in the face of facts will refuse to acknowledge them? Anyway, so after that testimony in India, ANI circulated a clip of my testimony excerpt, and they blanked out certain words. So where I said India's on this proto-fascist trajectory, they blanked out the proto-fascist trajectory bit. And so they doctored the testimony. The How I got to know of it is because somebody sent me a link to, I think it was one of those fact checking or some news, but it's also on my own CV at my website. There's which somebody did a news story on it, saying that ANI has actually done this to what I said. So it's actually that blatant that a news agency takes up something that is internationally spoken about on Kashmir, and it's there, and they take out certain words from it that are critical of India. State-centric media coverage, there's the lessening number of spaces. When my first novel, Residue, came out, it was reviewed in a whole lot of publications. And when Future Tense came out last year, in spite of the exceptional circumstances, not apart from Hindu, there were online reviews. No Indian publication reviewed it, and I don't, it's not that it's, and I've said this again in print before, it's not coincidental that journalists and media people in Kashmir who are on Facebook have now just not, they've not, many of them have stopped saying things that they used to be able to say on Facebook. So it's, it's a kind of multi-dimensional thing. Nobody says you're blacklisted, or if you post stuff, we're going to come and get you. They probably don't, it's not like there's a directive. I mean, there may be a directive, but it's not a public document. But in effect, that's what it means. It means that Indian institutions cannot organize seminars on Kashmir. They cannot, in the way that even until a few years ago, it used to at least be possible. Now you can't put Kashmir in the title. There'll be vigilantes who'll turn up. Or if they'll, or academics will say, well, can we have it phrased like this, and then you can talk about these critical things, but we can't really say that we're doing this. So there's this atmosphere of fear and self-censorship, and that's deliberately being signaled by people not amplifying voices, not, why would you, if you want to hear even, if you want to hear Kashmiri pundits, and you're talking to a whole range of Kashmiri pundits, and you'll only call the right wing voices, and you won't call somebody, okay, fine, you don't care that I'm a Kashmiri pandit myself, got evidenced and demonstrated claims to professional expertise on Kashmir. Why can't I be the person that you speak to? Because you don't want people to hear what I have to say, because that, then I'm not Muslim, and that creates a problem, because you can't just say it. So you'll just, they will end up, then they do end up saying you're jihadi, call me whatever. But they deliberately do not have voices. And likewise, the sorts of voices they amplify within Kashmir, on Kashmir, it's all very, very filtered through what narrative they want to project. And it's not like no country does that, but it's just so blatant. And there's just no space for voices. So some of the points that I had over here was, traditional media, newspapers in Kashmir, the adverts, they will either withdraw the adverts or bully the journalists. They'll call. So in recent years, even since 2019 August, since the constitutional coup, there've been, a range of journalists: Fahad Shah, Pirzada Sheikh, Masrat Zehra, journalists, photojournalists, men, women, who've been harassed in different ways. They may call people to police stations. They'll make their life difficult. They'll give them threats directly or indirectly. And the effect of all of this is that even what little used to be able to get printed in newspapers there is not printed anymore. So you can't have that. And of course, what's printed outside is not reflective of what's going on in Kashmir anyway. The I remember, in up until 2019, and I actually left Delhi on the night of 4th of August, and landed in London on the morning of the 5th. And I had, been to Kashmir earlier that year, not knowing that this is what would happen that night. Something was afoot. We all got that sense, but we didn't know what. The next months and months, it's really weird how all my life, 20, like, I think about stones and the fascination with, the kind of strange trauma of stones. 2010, the whole, so I did this thing on stone pelters, an image of a stone pelter made with stone, and it was so strange. And then to come here, and then that weird thing, because of course here people don't, you in the West, it's so hard for people to understand what's really going on. They'll just be like, oh, India, Pakistan, that's it. But they won't even, it's kind of really hard to get that understanding through here. And it was so blatant, so horrible and offensive, and all of that. And then so the next few months, I don't even know what happened. I remember, like, I had this kind of incident where, like, food got stuck. I had this choking thing. I began, I don't know how many interviews I gave, and how many talks, because it was just so important to have people here. And I just got really, really sick at the end of that. And then the lockdown happened, and at that point, they realized that I had, like, a really big stone inside me. So all of lockdown was just spent in horrible pain. So it's a very strange kind of a thing, where something, it's like a symptom manifesting inside your body. It's I don't know. And Kashmir is sort of like that. You can't, everything. I was speaking to this young Kashmiri girl who had come to see me, a student. She's, one of her parents is Kashmiri. So this is a few years ago, and I was speaking to her, and we were talking about, her. She had read my book. We were speaking about different things a few years ago, and then suddenly I checked my phone, and I find out that Shujat Bukhari has been shot dead. And so it's like, any of those news, it's just so violent in ways that defy all sense. Now I know why people there, if you meet somebody, like, they wouldn't want to meet you exactly at the time or the place that you've said, because there's, life, the uncertainties of existence. I haven't been back since since the August 2019. But the night that I was leaving, the immigration official said something to me about academics disappearing and whatever. And I just, it was just, after the testimony, people said, well, you can just go, and when you go, they'll just, like, you can just get run over. So there's this kind of atmosphere, menacing atmosphere, and you never know the intent of anybody. But what it has done is that it has destroyed people's abilities to trust each other. And that makes for even basic sorts of things, kind of basic sorts of community things really hard, because everyone is always suspect in some way. And some of these things, I mean, in future tense, which is about young people there, in some of these things I did try to reference there. I mean, the thing which Jad Bukhari came because he had retweeted that tweet of mine that I had, that just came up in my Facebook memories recently, where, so if I go to Kashmir, when I had gone to Kashmir, and at that time I used to go every year, there would be these newspapers, and if you pick up a Kashmiri newspaper on the same day and you pick up an Indian newspaper on the same day, so my tweet was to the effect that there's no perfect way to learn, but if only Indians could on a daily basis be able to just see the front page of a Kashmiri newspaper, a mainstream Kashmiri newspaper, they'd get a sense of what Kashmir is. Because in India, you would have this story and no mention, and in Kashmir, you'd have this story about people killed, and just the whole map of grief is so different, or this the map of news. And he had retweeted that, and I posted about that on Twitter, and then he of course died. He'd also done this book event, and I was there, and then Arti Tikku Singh in the testimony mentioned him as if that was like, as if there was like a complete diversity of, complete kind of opposition of views there. So yeah, I mean, so the newspapers on the same day are so different. And now looking back at that Facebook memory, I was just thinking that even those sorts of things now probably cannot be printed. So even that is something that would be hard for newspapers there to print now, because of everything that has happened since. I mean, TV channels in hotels. They So I remember that this person. So I asked somebody, like, what? Why don't you have NDT? You can subscribe to a certain number of channels, or you have them on. And I said, well, why don't you have these other channels, like the less horrible ones? And this person, why do you have Times Now? Why do you have Times Now? You open Times Now there, and it's just like poison, including on Kashmir. And he said, well, the tourists who come here want to watch Times Now. I'm sure not all, but my point is that there are also these ways in which, these subtle and other ways in which media gets shaped by who's consuming it. And so that was one thing I wanted to mention. The interrogation, harassment of journalists as a way of fear, encouraging fear, self-censorship, signaling, and numerous examples of Kashmiris who have been imprisoned, who have been harassed, threatened. I mean, forget about me. Think about someone like Khurram Parvez. Think about someone like Parveena Hangar, right? These are people who are well recognized human rights, in the human rights context, well recognized people who have. There's no way in which they're whatever your image of a Bollywood terrorist is. These are people who've given their life to documenting things, to just actually saying, well, here are the families of the disappeared, or here is the litany of human rights abuses. Even these people, you would never see them on an Indian TV channel, or. So what gets heard about Kashmir, even that context, you would hear their voices or read their words, but outside of India. Within that context, you cannot hear these people. And of course, last, I think, a few months ago, even their offices were raided, APDP and others. So there's the problem of which Kashmiris' voices get amplified, and there's the problem of which voices get amplified on Kashmir. And it's usually the possessive, territorial, nationalist, kind of very bigoted sorts of voices. Which voices speak about the rights of Kashmiris globally, then which voices speak about the rights of Kashmiris in India and in Pakistan. And I think that's really interesting too. That the right wing in India talks about Kashmir a certain way, and as opposed to the left, and it's the same in Pakistan, but it's kind of mirror opposite. In that Pakistani progressives would not speak as much about Kashmir, um, as the Indian progressive would. So the reasons for these sorts of divergences and symmetries and asymmetries is because of the sorts of stereotypes that are at play in who speaks about Kashmir, and what they can be heard saying. Um, And as I said, the way in which people get the sense of Kashmir, and there's enough and more work to demonstrate that, is through exoticization, demonization. They're not grateful enough. We're liberating their women, we're liberating their sexual minorities, we're saving them from themselves. And that somehow is also, and this is something that has been such an important kind of motivation in saying and doing and writing and speaking what I do, is how does that square with the case of Asifa? How does that square with the case of Hathras? How does that square with the Human Shield incident? I mean, you know, it's that's logic, right? But if you if you have it's some of this also goes back to the whole Chomsky media filters manufacturing consent sort of stuff, because if you have this kind of discussion, then you are really shifting, you're really shifting frames. You're not and there's no way even the most liberal Indian channel would have me on for a Q&A where I'm able to say these things, because those channels, because of who owns them and who hears them, have can reach people. So they'll never put people on who are able to get through the well and consistently crafted stereotypes about who Kashmiris are, why they are to be feared, why they're all predisposed to violence, why they're somehow irrational. It's not even like they're doing it for any purpose. They're only doing it because of Pakistan. There's no other reason why they're doing it. So it's multiple levels of ignorance, but also what I would say deliberately crafted ignorance in this context. And I think there are just so many ways in which solidarities, and for all of that we need to look transcontextually, and the yeah, I mean, no, struggles are not the same. I mean, for instance, I think that there's no real newspaper like Haaretz in India. I mean, not that I'm saying Haaretz is the best newspaper in the world, but what I'm saying is that the sort of piece in an article that might appear there about Israel today is not possible in any Indian newspaper to be that critical. The media has just basically censored itself, and there's just, I mean, after the whole Pulwama incident in February 2019 and before the elections, I mean, you had media people in combat gear into TV studios doing these really hyper nationalist awful. It's like there was no line to separate the role of media as journalists or as TV anchors or whatever from like everyone just vying to be the bigger soldier. And it's that kind of puerile machismo politics, that kind of nationalism, and gender is such a key part of it. I mean, I mentioned the exoticization and demonization part, and in the and, and something else that may be of interest is the 2018 article in Feminist Review called India's Obsession with Kashmir, Democracy, Gender, and Anti-Nationalism, where I talk about how it's not only about Kashmiri women. Gender is also at work in the ways in which, in terms of stereotypes of the feminine Kashmiri, or cartographically the Mother India stereotype in Kashmir as the head, that sort of logic, or in terms of rhetoric of possession, like the union between India and Kashmir being seen in marital terms or in terms of a petulant mistress, or that very fundamentally gendered kind of gender and land territory kind of way in which it gets seen. And that is at work. We saw that with the We'll Marry Fair Kashmiri Women and all of that after the revocation of the autonomy and constitutional coup. So to an extent, that these are things that are at work in different contexts of either self-determination, stateless nations, whatever those sorts of contexts. But um, and there are also specificities, and in the Indian context, I think what is specific right now and what is needs a lot more attention is the way in which the Hindutva ideology has just widened all of these you know um, chasms, and made it less and less possible for people to speak, for there to be spaces where people can challenge or speak out these experiences or their own truths. There's just no space for that anymore, which is not already sanctioned by the state, um, and conforming to the statist idea of what ought to be said and heard. It's very insecure. It's an insecure nationalism, very gendered, insecure sort of nationalism um, that they promote everywhere, in in other contexts too within India, but also and specifically on Kashmir, which is seen as this kind of paradigmatic anti-national sedition sort of context, where if you say these things, then you're not talking about rights or people, as if their suffering isn't real. And to do this in the name of just what about Kashmiri Pandits without actually even addressing that. I mean, they as with many of these things, I mean, the answers are really the steps forward are just some of the simplest things that any kind of with any good political will and intention that you would do, to inquire into massacres rather than to let them continue to be used and weaponized in this way. I mean, I'm not even for a moment, I'm not even talking about the bigger political context. I mean, it's just even the simplest things. And that's because it serves a purpose. It's the way it is because it is, it's serving very entrenched vested interests being the way it is. Yeah, I mean, the kind of the best way to kind of the easiest answer is yes. They definitely there's a weaponization of this, and that's why it gets used. The best way of actually getting more of a sense of my views is two specific things. There's an article in the Wire called "Kashmiri Pandits Are a Pawn in the Games of Hindutva." It's from 6th January 2016, if I'm not mistaken. It was after that scroll article, after the Al Jazeera head to head. So the Kashmiri Pandits are a pawn in the games of Hindutva in 2016, and something in Al Jazeera also. This was Wire. Something in Al Jazeera called the communalization of a political dispute, which was written in 2017 after the Amarnath Yatris were attacked that August, that summer, July or August. So that Al Jazeera article is called "The Communalization of a Political Dispute." Those two specific things, and then the third one would be the text of the congressional testimony, which is different from the video. And in that text, there's a subsection called "What about Kashmiri Pandits?" Because this is something that that keeps coming up, and it doesn't really matter how many times I've when people say that, it doesn't. And and after a point you realize that they're not really asking you, they're just doing that because that's their way of responding. That's the playbook. So it's like when the last 2 days, when I on Twitter, when I was writing about about the ways in which you can't have selective amnesia every 6 months about what Modi misgovernance has done to and how it has resulted in this horrible catastrophe where people are gasping for air. And they just come up with, oh, well, but you're not talking about the TRIPS waiver, and you're not talking about the fact that they're not giving us the mRNA and the Western. And the first couple of times I tried to screenshot my tweets and said, look, I actually, here are these tweets, and this, if logic makes a difference, here is the evidence. I'm not just saying this, I'm also saying that. And both, just because that is happening doesn't mean this isn't happening. Then after a point, I realized it doesn't really matter, because even when you do give, even when you do say that and there's no facts, then still that is, 2 hours later, another person or another person will ask you the same thing. So it becomes something more than a genuine question. It's just something that is a tool in that arsenal of hate. And so you have people just do this, what about Kashmiri Pandits, or why do you never speak about Kashmiri Pandits? And you can tell them, well, I did speak about it here and here and here, and and numerous other spoken interventions, but it doesn't really matter. They're not really interested in it. However, I think that this is as with all ideologies, I think it's a mix of people who are genuinely ignorant and people who are acting out of malice. I don't think that, I think there are people who, apart, and also there is genuine suffering of people who have, of people who have lost their homeland either directly or indirectly or whatever. I mean, what would I not give to be able to have a home? I mean, I've gone back and seen that building, but it's, it's just it's a physical space. It's not a to have those kinds of bonds. No, nobody wants to kind of feel this sense of various kinds of multiplied displacements. But so it's not that that's not real, it's that the way in which this whole thing has become used. And so what my simple thing is, there's, yes, I mean, first of all, grief must be witnessed, but it should not be witnessed in a balance sheet. And I call this, and in my work I've called this the discourse of competing victimhoods. It's not like a competition where my pain is bigger than yours. It's like that. In fact, these are two kinds or different kinds of Kashmiris who have been failed by the same state, and therefore it makes the in the interests of justice and humanity, it's actually the these questions ought to be asked by different groups of people, by Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Muslims, and other groups within and outside the valley. Instead of that, of course, this becomes turned into a thing of, this happened, and then it's like, well, this person was killed in this way, and how do you kind of rank, you know mass rapes against gang rapes against people being, I'm sorry, these are horrible things. How do you do this, like people being tortured and with electricity in their genitals versus people who have been, versus a nurse who has been hacked to be, this whole thing, it's just macabre, and it's it's not the sort of thing that helps anyone. So what needs to happen is for there to be inquiries into massacres of Kashmiri Pandits and also of all of the other massacres, including the Kashmiri Sikh massacres and the various massacres of Kashmiri Muslims. But that requires political will. It requires it requires a judiciary that it requires basically a whole framework of institutions that actually has any kind of an interest in addressing the situation. And that doesn't happen. I mean, why would you not have this sort of thing? And truth and reconciliation commissions, you want to, but at least have the basic inquiries into the massacres that hold the the culprits for them to account, that provide, declassify the documents from that time. These are just very basic things. You don't, it's, there's nothing very kind of original or innovative in every conflict. That's what one would do. So I think there's that, which doesn't happen. And instead of that, you get this kind of, we're going to do this for Kashmiri Pandits, and then those voices get amplified. So, and outside of Kashmiri Pandits, if you think about the ordinary Indian, for them, I'm saying there's a section of people who are ignorant, and because they have been within the cocoon, their bubble, which has not exposed them to any of this complexity. I mean, even Article 370, before it was abrogated, revoked, and before all of that happened, most people didn't know what it specifically meant in the context of Kashmir or how it had been eroded. Most Indians, I mean. So there's that, and then there's that is compounded by people who do know better or should know better, but act out of malice, who just, who, because it serves their purposes. And that is not mapped into an literate illiterate binary. I don't think, it's not that only illiterate people are ignorant. There are very many very literate, including very well informed people, including in the media, who should know better, but act as if they don't when it comes to Kashmir. And and I'm not a purist. I'm not saying that you have to be, people can't be wrong or whatever, but it's revealing to see how, when somebody is wrong, how that is important to the rest of what they're saying. So it's not like, so it's not that one that nothing Rousseau said, random example, but just thinking back to my Imagining Economics book, it's not that nothing Rousseau said on whatever, on political economy is relevant, because he was, or Kant, because because he held these views about black people or about Africa or whatever. But the point is that you can't ignore those things they said, because they were able to say that, structure the rest of what they were saying based and predicated on these things. And so this is So this is an argument I've made in the context of, and this is something that keeps coming up now ever more, right, with this whole question of history and of decolonizing, is that it's not really, it's not impossible, it's not hard, it's not about not knowing things, it's about knowing. Knowledge is actually important, that thing, because then you figure out how, what these dead greats said on these other things were important to what they were able to say and why they were able to be heard. So in the same way, I think that in the context of Kashmir, I'm not saying that Indian journalists and many liberals, and liberal is a word that gets used in different ways in different contexts. And I mean, I think it is possible historically, I mean, I think it is possible to rescue a certain version of liberalism, but that's a philosophical question. That's not what most people mean when they are talking about liberals. So I'm just clarifying that it is. And in that sense, I think that the people who see themselves as being liberal are actually have their blinders when it comes to questions of Kashmir, which is sort of like the outer limit of their explanatory frame. That's where they stop, and that's not what they would push at. And that doesn't mean that they're not, that nothing else that they've ever done is relevant. It may be, and sometimes is, but I think it's important to also keep calling out that this thing is this is wrong, or this doesn't make sense, or it's not consistent with what you claim to be about. And that in the Indian context is very much the case with and in other contexts, but right now that's what I'm speaking about, that they would not re- yeah, on Kashmir it's just like it gets to some kind of a silence that, oh, but that's, we'll talk about all of these other things, but not Kashmir. Um, so yes, Kashmiri Pandits get that issue gets weaponized. It doesn't get addressed. There are people who are ignorant. There are people who should know better and do know better, but act as if they don't. And within the Kashmiri Pandit community, I mean, I think they've just as I said, I mean, I don't even, I mean, I have to constantly issue these disclaimers about, like, I'm not speaking on behalf of an organization. I'm speaking as a person, and, and I'm not a religious person, etc., etc. Because because I'm not speaking for anyone. I do not want to speak for anyone. But I cannot not speak, being a woman, being a Kashmiri, being a person who has a certain kind of relationship to Kashmir. That is my way of making sense of my existence, of my politics, and where that takes me. So I have to say these things, and and therefore I have to be heard not only as a Kashmiri who happens to have the surname Kaul, but also as somebody who has spent time and effort and emotion in studying and understanding and kind of implicating and engaging with what Kashmir is in terms of a place and its people and the knowledge that has been generated on it. And that is mediated through my specific kind of standpoints, which doesn't come only because I'm a certain person with a certain name, surname. It comes because of my own experiences, as I said, of being a woman who has a metal plate in her arm, who has physical disablements that mean I can't just type things and be online. So I have specific ways of relating to the world, and that determines how I relate to people, and uh, you know what what that what experiences that gives me, and how I think through things, and how that changes over time. As I said, I mean, I would not have known this as a child. I would not have had these views, because that's not what I knew then. So it's these things are also journeys, and I'm not, so this is not about diminishing anyone's pain or suffering or loss or any of that. This is just to say that there are ways in which we can try to come to terms with loss, which are not about silencing others, or continuing this kind of endless vicious cycle perpetually of violence, revenge, and because that doesn't stop anywhere. That just goes on, as we have seen this. I mean, this kind of celebration, rival celebration of, this is your comeuppance, this is your comeuppance. Where does that end? It's really very simple stuff in one from one way of looking at it. But it's instead of that, I mean, who's gonna, which TV channel will have that much time to have anyone speak about all of this? They'll just like have a headline. This is, some of this is also determined by the ways in which media and experiences are consumed in capitalist systems, where you have kind of like this 5 minute thing within which you have to say this, and this is what so there's no kind of it's the way in which our public spheres get ever more decimated, and totalitarianisms continue with their march forward, because there aren't spaces for thought. There aren't spaces for just thinking, as thinking per se, thinking as just thought of things. It's and you just have kind of these battle of cliche versus cliche, which is happening in that context, and we are all kind of suffering for it, in terms of what we can see or hear. But it, of course, differentially affects people. And the really sinister thing about these projects, going back again to that India China thing, the really sinister thing about these projects is how they use this idea of history, and how they kind of really turn it on its head, and the whole material and psychic binary. People may not have food, but you'll give them like this pride of, they may be dying, but that's the whole thing of of how many kind of really successful right-wing hegemonic projects work, both religious and non-religious ones, is that they give that sense of, it doesn't matter what people are actually seeing, the things they are experiencing, even they will still find a way of bridging that cognitive dissonance and saying, no, actually it's not that, it's something else. Or and the use of kind of metaphysical narratives of good and evil and suffering and overcoming and all of that, it's even happening now. I mean, you're kind of, there's a storm and we have to overcome this and we have to stay whatever. It's as if these are just entirely created things that are there. They're not, as if this is not just actually all things that ought to be addressed, that can be addressed. So it's I mean, so in that sense, epistemologically and all, it's part of a much bigger problem of of a certain kind of late capitalist non-modernity, I suppose. If we're thinking in Latchford's terms, like we're not even modern, we have never been modern. So I don't know, I mean, it gets really depressing, or ever more, like every other day now. I feel like every time I'm speaking to somebody, I end up to the point where people say, well, where's the hope? And I just, like, I have to do a double take and tell myself, no, there is some hope. And there is some hope, of course there is hope. But it's like you have to, the kind of the instinctive way in which you would strive, because you knew. I think with the last 2 years, ever more, the kind of the catastrophic exacerbation of inequalities, the blatant way in which it just gets worse and worse and worse. It makes you really think, like, you really have to, it's actually, you have to, it's like my hope fuse kind of just keeps blowing out, and I have to like physically go up and lift that fuse and go like, no, actually there is hope. So yes, there is hope, because that's how we go on. But yeah, it's very depressing, all in all. I mean, these are really terribly depressing times. And the fact of how the lockdown in Kashmir, then gets legitimized with the whole world in lockdown, and then you have people who are living these fractal lockdowns within lockdowns, and the the sorts of perverse occupations and colonizations that are carried out in the name of development, that once were carried out in the name of civilization, and sometimes still are carried out also in the name of civilization. It's all so grim, and the chance that we have of addressing any of this is through thought, is through critical thinking and education, and the attack on all of that is also so severe. One, through the economic means, through kind of the commercialization of education, and kind of restricting access to education through the resource demands, but also through the ways in which what what gets taught. So now more and more like STEM and science and all of that, and not thinking of humanities and the attacks on critical theory, on gender studies, on, on alternative kinds of thought. It's I don't know. I grieve for our species. I feel like um, we're I feel like if some creature came from another planet and looked at us, they would be really, truly very surprised to think that we let these numbers of people die and suffer consistently over long periods of time. Let's take the Kashmir example in this region, because there's not even anything real, but because we have certain representations of that region where we have these lines and we think they're so sacrosanct that we'll continue to let these people suffer, and then we're going to get them to fight with each other based on their religion or based on their pains. It if you zoom out enough, it's just so illogical, all of it. And the reason it goes on is because it serves interest where people are materially or in terms of prestige or whatever better off by doing these things. And well, why would they do that? Because somewhere the moral calculus really fundamentally fails people. These are kind of at the base also very philosophical questions about what we're doing as societies, about how people think what is right and wrong, the kind of basic ethical thing compass that isn't there, which is why you have these sorts of situations that you now have with everything, where yeah. And I mean, I don't know, sorry, it's not like a theory of everything, but I really feel these things, because in thinking in these different registers, sometimes there are points where they start to converge, and I just feel that it's in some sense really very simple, but also just almost labyrinthine, of such labyrinthine complexity, that you feel like every all we can do is just to keep on chipping at what is a huge, enormous kind of obstruction. And but we know that that is what our meaning making must, at least that is all we can do. But even if that is all we can do, we have to continue doing that. And with something like with something like Kashmir or these kinds of things, this is what it is. It's you have to just maybe, and it's that's why it's so important to 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 resonate with other groups, like with people. I mean, like you guys are doing this thing, the other collective. It feels like all my life I've just been part of one or other. When I was in economics, there used to be like the an other. So my book is called Imagining Economics Another Way. And the an other, it's meant to be like an other way. They used to, so the mainstream conference, and then there used to be like this. It used to actually be called, it's now called the Heterodox Economics Conference. It used to be called the Other Economics Conference. So like, this thing of we're constantly having to step away from something to be able to say, well, not that, not that. And the very fact, I suppose there's some hope in that. We're trying to change the frames of what we hear about. And we're trying to say, well, actually not this, not this. And that critical consciousness really is important, because if we don't do that, then we have nothing to it's not a phoenix or a unicorn or a yeti, in the sense that nobody's ever seen it. It's possible for something like that to exist. So I'm not denying that someone may not ever have experienced it. I mean, I think that an important impulse to many of these projects of native perverse nativism in in say let's say the South Asian context, is also the ways in which those people have historically had to contend with marginalizations, discriminations, and racisms within within broadly inverted comma the West, within the geographical kind of Euro America or other places. So and that sustained experience might obviously, as human beings, we are creatures of emotion. So those things might feed into how people perceive that they're not valued. I mean, I'm actually so and that's not the exception anywhere. I mean, whether they do that to a person because misogyny is not recognized as a hate crime, but whether they do that to a person because they are a woman, or because they are Muslim, or because they are of a different skin color, if you're black or a brown or whatever, or Asian, East Asian person, or or for any of those reasons, or possibly I imagine it could also happen because somebody is a Hindu, but yeah, so there's that. It's not inconceivable. The I also, like, this Friday I have to go to actually a court case here on a racist attack last year, where some racist guy physically tried to attack me, and not even it's possible also for people from kind of non-traditional groups to do this. So yeah, there's that's first of all. I'm not saying it's impossible. Is this something that offsets Islamophobia as a thing? Is this something that somehow makes Islamophobia or any other kind of religious hate acceptable? Absolutely not. That is just like completely self-defeating, makes no sense or purpose. Is any one particular group always and forever historically beleaguered? Again, not. That changes. Including in any different society, there have been different times when people, there have been kind of fears of the yellow peril or whatever. Different groups of people have risen up and down these hierarchies of hate in terms of how they've been perceived by people, and some of that is also linked to how those countries got perceived, and to what are called strategic interests, but are actually, I don't like using the word strategic because I feel like it gives them too much importance and validation. Um, so it doesn't justify, even if it were to exist, it doesn't justify any other kind of religious or other hate. Is that and so therefore the idea of using Hindu phobia as a way of combating evidential instances of widespread Islamophobia or any other kind of hate sentiment, anti-Semitism, whatever, is, makes no sense, because that's not, it's not there. And also there is enough evidence of structurally there being structural historical evidence of things like, at different points in time and with different amounts of intensity, of things like anti-Semitism, of things like Islamophobia, and because of the ways those people, those groups of people and communities or religions were seen and perceived. Is there a particular reason why there should be Hindu phobia in this to the same sort of extent? I don't think so. I don't think logically that in many societies there's any particular reason why Hindus are, in that kind of grouping. So if we are therefore talking about Hindu phobia in India, then that's even stranger, because Hindus are a majority in India, and the very idea of Hindu as in this sense is some kind of a manufactured entity, because within that there is the whole phenomenon of caste. And so it's not something that is used by, Hindu phobia is not something that would be sort of like a Dalit argument. So I don't know, so therefore in multiple kind of conceptual legal evidence-based ways, it makes no sense to deploy this phrase in as in any way to combat any other kind of hate. And it does help in constructing a beleaguered sort of sentiment, and that has political profit attached to it by supremacist parties. Any supremacist parties anywhere function in this way. Ethno-nationalist or religious supremacist parties function by creating a sense of a community under attack, and that's what they're doing. um yeah, so that's my response to like Hindu phobia. That's what I would say. So therefore that it can exist. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Probably there are Hindus subject to some kinds of, phobic attacks by people, but it's not, I mean, structurally, is it as relevant as some of the other things that we're talking about? Not at all. And that's not, and I haven't seen it being argued in anywhere except by very, by very demagogic kind of ideological sorts of online platforms where people use it to delegitimize those who are drawing attention to the ways in which Muslims are vilified and demonized and marginalized and subject to violence, the kinds of violence. I mean, the kinds of violence that uh, um, I mean, who's the there's something I published in December 2020 called Islamophobia in India. Again, that might be interesting. So, where there's documented kind of evidence. So I'm saying, like in the Indian context, Islamophobia plays out in various ways. It's multidimensional. It's kind of like the Indian Muslim as a kind of suspect citizen. It's the Kashmiri Muslim as is always already terrorist. It's the Muslim immigrant as this invasive pest, and it's the neighboring state of Pakistan as this kind of existential other. So there are these, at least these four ways in which, and then there are so many instances of of this kind of egregious violence against Muslims in India today that has multiplied, that is blatant. I mean, those men who were, again, sorry, but those men who were beaten by the police and asked to sing the national anthem, it's even got pictures of all of that. So it's I mean, so I have, so to people who are saying that it's not a balance sheet, but here it is. If you want evidence, there's enough and more of it. Academic censorship on Kashmir. So in the UK, most Kashmiris are, so Kashmiri Hindus are not the majority of Kashmiris here. In UK, the Kashmiris mostly are not most Kashmiris are not from the Indian, but from the Pakistan side of Kashmir. So actually, the if we're talking like in numbers, so what would I say? A few points. I think there's a between the Kashmiris from uh, Kashmiris from Pakistan side of Kashmir, there are different viewpoints within them. So people who are kind of more who feel more indigenously Kashmiri, and people who feel kind of more, who are okay with being Pakistani Kashmiri. So that's kind of one cleavage. There's in the recent census as well, there was this campaign to get Kashmiris recognized as an ethnicity, as an identity, so that people don't have to tick the box of Indian or Pakistani, but they have another box which says, well, Kashmiri. So those are the sorts of things that are at work here. In terms of university, I think it's broader than Kashmir. In terms of the growing kind of rules and restrictions about those pre-event clearances where you have to sign whether you're doing anything, there's due diligence, and there's you've got clearance and whatever, etc. So those sorts of forms and all that is there with speakers. Whether there is academic censorship on Kashmir institutionally, I have not experienced institutional, but I may be in an institute which is, my university is one of the most diverse university, if not the most diverse university in the UK in terms of where the students are from. And it's a university that actually takes all these commitments really seriously, and I'm really happy to have colleagues, and I know how rare this experience is, but like my colleagues are people who are really trying their level best to make this better. And so in that sense, as my institution, no, but broadly, I mean, online, definitely yes. I mean, I remember just, I think last year or just after the 2019 thing, apart from this kind of online hate, I mean, I have folders of this. I mean, it sounds like something you can deal with, but it's not always so easy to deal with it, because sometimes you just get fed up with the abuses and insults to you and your family. And I don't even have I mean, I don't have that kind of family. As I said, I've lost all that because of my views a long time ago, but I do have a mother and a sister, and I'd like to, like, hold on to them. So when you have people who find addresses and who threaten them, who are not, they're only related to me, that's their only crime, it's really kind of, you I do feel like I put other people at risk anyway. So this person, this PhD student at in some French university, some Indian origin PhD student. He did this kind of whole thing on Twitter, calling all sorts of, making all sorts of allegations about me being married to some Pakistan embassy employee, and they just come up with such specific lies. I mean, it's so gross. Like, their lies are so specific. Like, I mean, he had this thing about who I was married to and what I was doing. I mean, I was living by I am and was living by myself. I mean, at that time I had a tree which is dead now, but it's just the and he would tag he tagged my employers and all of that. And so there is that thing of, and luckily my colleagues and others spoke up. But the thing that we have, as with any institution anywhere, is that your work needs to be validated by, for its value and worth, by people outside of, outside of just the journals that you publish in and the books that you write. So that means that for impact and other purposes, it is important. I mean, this is one of the reasons that it's really important for people to actually say, so that your organizations, institutions, universities can know that what you're doing matters. Because when they do that, then the institution thinks that, oh well, because institutions are institutions, right? What do they know? So then they think that, oh, what she's doing is actually not all of these things that these horrible trolls are saying online. She's not a jihadi, she's not a commie, she's not doing this because she's paid or whatever, she's an employee of something. She's doing this because of these reasons, and there are there are these people who validate. So those structures are really important to, to for the jobs and works of people like me to continue, for our voices to be heard, because then people who don't have any clue actually believe that what we're doing is making sense. So there's that kind of constraint in terms of peer validation, and just people, reading, writing, citing, so that, okay, well, this person's doing something. And we did, when real life events were possible, especially, we did a lot of events on stateless nations in Palestine, Kashmir, Kurds, Tibet. We have people who have been working with post-colonial, decolonial approaches, staff and students both. And you do have, you have instances where people would get up, and unless I'm really missing something, maybe I'm tired, maybe I'm missing something, but there have been, it's not ever gotten to a point of a violent confrontation, thankfully, in kind of my experience. There have been, and but that just may be because this is London, because there is, it's a, and because it's a diverse student body, and because there are people who are not organizing that way. But this whole hurt sentiments thing, I mean, there's some of it happening everywhere, with Chinese hurt sentiments on Xinjiang or Tibet, or Indian hurt sentiments on Kashmir or whatever. So there's some of that happens, but I don't think that it's like the US situation. um, I don't think it's like that. I think that it's not institutions. I don't know about institutions there, but here it's not so much institutions that are your bane. It's more very organized IT cell type people who make your life really hard, who make your who keep your voice from being heard, and who try and write to your employers, to your to your colleagues, or your vice chancellors, even your heads of school. They'll email those people and they'll say, oh well, this person, whatever. So there's that kind of vilification and harassment, but not like my institution hasn't said to me, you can't do this. And that's, I mean, I wouldn't stand for that anyway. I don't think that any academic who believes in their work would. But no, it's not as blatant as an institution saying that, but it is a lot of organized, as I said, organized IT cell type people messaging, emailing, trolling, that sort of thing. Yes. Yeah, there's a photo essay that I did in 20, oh gosh, when was that? 2016 or 2017. Um, it came out on the it was timed to come out on 15th August of that year, and it was called We Want Freedom, but it was about
Mhm.
Kashmir. So I think, yeah, 2016 or 2017. It's called We Want Freedom, and it was published in
Okay.
Captive Census, and it
Okay.
was published in open license. And it's got like pictures of, the whole thing is a photo essay. There's like 10 or 12
Right.
pictures of, and with some kind of explanatory text. But all of
Yeah.
those pictures, I think that those pictures will be really interesting because they are of the valley. So they've got the barbed wires, but they also show you the sorts of things that you normally wouldn't see, and the sorts of things that in future tense that I talk about. These people standing at the sides of the roads with a gun in one hand and a bat in the other,
Right.
and on all that graffiti. And of course, the state keeps trying to wipe out that graffiti every time, but it's in the nature of resistance that it doesn't go away. But some of those pictures are from Batmalu, which is a locality in Srinagar that's sort of like at the was the kind of, to use their terms, hotbed of resistance. and especially like after the Burhan Wani. Oh, so this must be 2017, because there was the Burhan Wani graffiti in there, so that happened in 2016. So that means the essay was 15th August 2017. And yeah, it's just these spaces that at any moment can just go from being one kind of a space to another, with groups of young people and policemen chasing after them. And so yeah, and there's also kind of one of a shutter with "We Want Freedom" behind. So I keep thinking about UK academia. You kind of bury things sometimes in your mind because you don't want to kind of save that trauma, because there's enough to deal with. So I think I just buried that somewhere. So no, normally you would have things that would have approval things and whatever, and restricted entry. So you have to scan cards. So not just anyone can come in, they would sign, etc. And you have lists circulated beforehand. But one particular incident that definitely stands out is this happened at SOAS. There were so this was organized by South Asia Solidarity Group at SOAS, and they organize various kinds of things. And in this one, there was this panel. It was chaired by Divyesh Anand, and there was me. There was Kavita Krishnan. There was Amrit Wilson, and there was one other person whom I did not know, whom I hadn't met before that day. And so we had just begun, and these people wearing masks came in, and they and they started, and they obviously had planned it, so they recorded this as well. And they made a video, and they started chanting, and they left these posters saying "Gaze for JNK." So they came in chanting "Gaze for JNK," uh, and said that because you're talking about Kish. And the event, I don't know what the event title was, Wounded Pellets in Paradise. And they came in chanting all that. They made the video, and they basically alleged that the people on that panel were against gay rights, and that's why they were being, yes, Article 370 had been abrogated. So this is October 2019, and they said that these people are against gay rights, and they are criticizing India while India is trying to ensure the rights of the sexual minorities there. And I have and then they had various their own kind of media pick it up and say that SOAS seminar was interrupted by gay rights activists who allege that whatever, without being comprehensive enough to include the other details. And Kavita was speaking at the time, and we all had to be rushed outside, and the alarms went off and whatever. So those sorts of things they stage. So they do this sort of thing, like stage a disruption, record it, and then get their own media to circulate it. So creating non-factual sorts of news. And I mean, when they posted this online, I remember their people, Abhijit Iyer and Mitra and all those people had also retweeted that. I remember at that time responding, and I had like specific points saying, well, at this point, at this point into the video, there's a response that whatever, and these are the ways in which you're wrong, basically. And they hadn't even heard us. So they will do those sorts of things. They will basically use some kind of progressive cause to try and malign people, and just kind of just throw something at them and hope that it would stick with this sort of intervention. So that they definitely did, and which was really awful. And and I forgot to mention, I mean, and there's nobody on that panel who would have disagreed with gay rights. The chair is actually somebody who works for gay rights, who is who identifies as queer himself. So the whole thing was just completely false and an absolute lie. But they did get enough number of people, media sources, to actually put this on their websites to say that this was somehow real. That was really disturbing, actually. You feel so helpless because you have these news reports which are saying that you're against gay rights, and you just think like, but that's in the nature of those news sources. They'll just pick them up, and then you can try and it's their strategy. It's the kind of Modi Trump right-wing sort of strategy. They'll just throw something out, and then you spend all your time and energy trying to respond to it. Yes, here it is. Resisting Fascism, Building Solidarities, India, Kashmir, and Beyond. That was that event. And it was from 5th October 2019. That was really awful because Indian media picked that up and said as if they were, and it's the same thing. It's like it's like a very clever media concerted effort to just like, if they can't counter what you're saying, what they'll do is engineer some sort of a distraction or diversion so that all of the attention gets taken up by that. They did that with the testimony too. So, instead of reporting that these are the things that got said at the US Congress on 22nd October 2019, what they focused on in many Indian media forums was Aarti Tikku and Ilhan Omar got into a spat, which wasn't even the case. I mean, she was basically just being offensive. I think it was being offensive, but that was because what that meant was then they wouldn't have to report how her testimony did not, was comprehensively kind of combat, like um, addressed and countered, and what I had said, because then they wouldn't need to report what I had said. They could just keep the focus on, oh well, she said this to Ilhan Omar, and not, because then they would not have to say what I said or what the other guy said or what Angana said or what Ilan said to us. So yeah, it's one of those kind of tried and tested ways of, when you can't counter them, you just kind of engineer some sort of a distraction so that whatever they're saying doesn't get heard. This whole point about, are states even moral actors? I don't know. I mean, when one speaks about rights, there's the ways in which states function. I mean, there's been a globally proliferation of it's about taking things under erasure, that you're saying them, but at the same time you know them to be problematic. So, when you say, yes, there are people struggling for a state because they are a stateless nation, you're doing that, but at the same time you're also aware of the paradox of how states function and how even that state might function if that were to then be a state, if somehow that were to be a state. So there's that kind of thing that, that they so and this gets used. So India is doing this, but then that doesn't, that doesn't mean that there isn't patriarchy within Kashmiri society. So, that India uses, and as recently did, so India uses a fashion show to select and project that everything's normal in Kashmir. Is, of course, it's a problem, but that doesn't mean that objection, protests against that fashion show by other women are not, that they are not also capable of restricting the rights of other Kashmiri women in the name of religion or patriarchy or society or community or whatever. So these are complexities, and that's what they those are the sorts of divisions they exploit and thrive upon. The right-wing ideologies exploit and thrive upon, because they take these pre-existing things and then they kind of manipulate them in ways that in ways that give them success. I mean, especially the BJP. I mean, they've done that with elections in Assam and other places as well, and with Kashmir. I mean, so what is important is to keep drawing attention to it, even if even if it's like one person listening to you, even if it's nobody listening to you. I think just doing meaningful work makes sense, because it's there, right? At some point, it might make a difference in some way to somebody's thought process, and thoughts are seeds, and they may grow, and we never know where they may grow. So it's still worth doing it, even if mainstream media doesn't cover it, even if they, in whatever ways, in some is that ways, in other ways of kind of functioning within the, however one can function within that system. It's like the Chinese, the circulation of those milk cartons with the expired dates of the Tiananmen Square massacre, because everyone who sees them knows that that's what that is. So I think it's like we find ways of communicating meaning and memory of that kind of suffering, no matter what.